Hi St George's, happy St George's Day. Today is the 23rd of April, and the 23rd of April in England is our National Patron Saint's Day for St George. So firstly, happy St George's Day. I thought today, because it's St George's Day, it would be nice to share the story of St George with you and share the legend and share the real story of St George with you as well. Now, I've been listening to a history podcast, and the history podcast is called Homeschool History. And this podcast is by the man who is the historian who helps to write horrible histories. And lots of you will know horrible histories is one of my favorite things. So in Homeschool History, he tells you a little bit about some time in history, and then he asks you to do a quiz. So I'm going to do this today all about St George's Day. So listen carefully. I'm going to tell you some stories and some facts, and then at the end, there's going to be a 5-question quiz. So here we go. Now, I'm sure lots of you, when you think about St George, you think about St George and the dragon. And this is the legend. So the story goes that St George was traveling through Libya, which is a country in North Africa, and there was a village that was being plagued by a dragon, and they'd been feeding sheep to the dragon, and they'd run out of sheep. So the king had decided that now they would have to give children to the dragon. So they did it like a lottery, and they just picked a child from the village to feed to the dragon. It's not very nice, is it? And one day, the lottery picked out the king's daughter. So the king was going to have to give his daughter to feed the dragon. And as she was walking towards the dragon, along came St George, and he offered to slay the dragon. That means kill the dragon. And he killed the dragon so that the king's daughter didn't have to be eaten. And that meant that they celebrated him. So they had a big feast in the village to say thank you to St George. And that's where the legend comes from. So that's the story that's traveled through the centuries about St George and the dragon, and that he was like a knight in shining armor. You can see on this picture, he's a knight in shining armor slaying the dragon like a hero. But the real story is a little bit different. So the real story is about St George, who was born in Turkey. And you can see there on the map where Turkey is. And he was born in a Christian family in Turkey, and he joined the Roman army. So I'm sure lots of you know a lot about the Roman Empire, and people from all over the world joined the Roman Empire, and George joined the Roman Empire. He was born in the 3rd century, it was a very, very long time ago. And he joined the army, and the emperor at the time was called Emperor Diocletian. Now, lots of the Roman emperors weren't very nice, and Diocletian was one of them. And the Romans didn't like the Christians. So you might know this from your Bible stories as well with Jesus, that lots of the Roman emperors wanted to kill Christians. Now, St George was in a bit of a predicament because he was a Christian, but he was also in the Roman army. And he was asked to kill Christians. And he said, absolutely not, I will not do that. So he was killed. Now that's what we call a martyr, somebody who dies for their faith and dies for their beliefs. So St George was a martyr. So whether you know the legend of St George or whether you now know the true story of St George, he's a really great person to have as our patron saint. So the next question is, what is a patron saint? We use that term a lot. And it says here, a patron saint is a saint who's been chosen to protect a particular place or area of life. So they don't have to come from that place, but they have to embody the characteristics that the country want to show the world that they believe in. So here's an example, St. Francis. You've probably heard of St. Francis of Assisi. He's the patron saint of animals. And I'm sure you all know St. Valentine and what he's the patron saint of. But interestingly, when I was doing my research, I also found out that St. Valentine is not just the patron saint of love, but also of beekeepers. That's very strange, isn't it? So, how did St George become our patron saint? He's actually the patron saint of a lot of countries, and he never, ever, ever came to England. He never visited England, but he is our patron saint. So from about the 9th century, we celebrated St. George in England, but it was in 1327, Edward III, this is a picture of Edward III here, Edward III decided to make him our patron saint. And when Edward III was thinking about, well, what does St. George, what are his characteristics that we want to be as England? He talked about good versus evil, and he talked about courageous leadership, and he talked about the country being well protected. So they are all qualities that St. George had, and Edward III wanted those to be the qualities that we talked about in England as well. And that's how he became our patron saint. But he's also patron saint of lots and lots of other places. So I wonder if I can challenge you to find out where else St. George is the patron saint of. So Edward III made him our patron saint in 1327. And why April the 23rd? Well, it is thought that that is the day that St. George was killed by the Romans. So the day he was martyred. And that's why we celebrate on the 23rd of April. And it wasn't always a huge big deal in England until Henry VIII came along. And I know lots of you will know lots about Henry VIII. But he had a huge battle in 1415. And that was the Battle of Agincourt. And after the Battle of Agincourt, he made the 23rd of April, St. George's Day, one of the biggest feast days in England. And that's why lots of people still celebrate it today. So that's a little bit of history about St. George, the legend and the real St. George. So here are the quiz questions. So you can either just shout them out loud, or you can get a piece of paper and write down the answers. So the first question is, where was the real St. George born? I wonder if you can remember back. Where was the real St. George born? Then the next question is, what was the name of the Roman emperor who had him killed? Bit more tricky. Then, which English king made him our patron saint? Which English king made him our patron saint? And then question 4, in the legend, in the story I told you, what did St. George kill? That's a really easy one. And the last one, what date do we celebrate St. George's Day on in England? So you can pause this if you want to have a little think about it. I'm going to show you the answers on the next screen. So if you want to pause it now. And if not, here are the answers. So where was the real St. George born? He was born in Turkey in the 3rd century. What was the name of the Roman emperor? That was Emperor Diocletian. Which English king made him our patron saint? That was Edward III. I wonder if you can find out a little bit about Edward III. What did St. George kill in the legend? That was easy. He killed a dragon. And what date do we celebrate St. George's Day on in England? Well, it's today, the 23rd of April. So, happy St. George's Day. I hope you've learned something. Hope you've got a little bit of history and you've had a little bit of fun doing the quiz. And I will speak to you all soon. Take care.